Look deep into this crystal ball to see your future. We predict that in the next hour, you're going to meet some of nature's most clairvoyant creatures. That's because we're counting down the top 10 most extreme psychics in the animal kingdom to find who has the strangest supernatural powers. We'll sort out the phonies from the phenomenal when psychics are taken to the most extreme. Earth is a planet of extremes. Extreme places and extreme animals. But some animals are more extreme than others. Join us as we count down to find the most unusual, the most extraordinary, the most extreme. For thousands of years, fortune tellers have claimed they can predict the future. Some animals are also said to have psychic powers. So do you believe in the paranormal? Back in the 18th century, people certainly believed the peculiar predictions of our first contender, especially when someone was critically ill. With limited medical care, loved ones could do little but sit and wait. The morbid vigil was called the death watch. And this is when the animal at number 10 in the countdown made its so-called lethal prediction. The terrifying tapping emanating from the walls was an omen of certain death, and it was made by our first psychic contender, the Death Watch beetle. So is it true? Can the Death Watch beetle really predict someone's death? Well, sometimes people did die after hearing the beetle's tapping, but it didn't mean the insect was psychic. A Death Watch beetle spends most of its life alone, burrowing deep inside wood. When an adult emerges, it needs to find a mate, so it uses its head to tap out a love song. Ironically, this misunderstood bug is signaling to create new life, not death. The beetle is number 10 in the countdown because the only thing it predicts is a hot date. It's even possible to fool a male beetle by using a machine to mimic the call of a lonely female. Having honed in on the love song, the vibrating plastic proves something of a disappointment. But 200 years ago, the human response to the tapping was very different. Today, it's hard to believe that a lovesick beetle was once linked to imminent death. Which is why we can safely say that our first contender has no psychic powers. However, as our countdown continues, we'll discover there are animals that can predict events in the future, occasionally using methods that baffle even the most skeptical scientists. In many parts of the world, a pleasant summer's day can quickly turn into a washout. Today, meteorologists rely on satellites and computers to predict the weather. But once, people consulted a four-legged forecaster, the cow. In New England, there was a popular saying, "A cow with its tail to the west makes weather the best." And A cow with its tail to the east makes weather the least. So is it true? Can you really predict bad weather using a cow and a compass? Well, cattle often stand with their tails to the wind. In the wild, this means they could see a predator approaching from the front or smell a predator sneaking up behind them. As a rule of thumb in the northern hemisphere, good weather generally blows in from the west, while bad weather approaches from the east. So, the cow's instinct to face away from the breeze tells us which way the wind's blowing, and possibly what kind of weather system's approaching. While it seems the cow's intuitive power involves little more than using its rump as a weather vane, there are people using mysterious powers in the fields of America. In rural Massachusetts, Dolores Cook wants to locate an underwater source for her garden.
Oh, good morning. How are you? Fine, thank you for coming.
But rather than drill at random, she's called in Susan McNeil Spooler. Susan is a trained industrial engineer and a dowser. Dowsers claim they can locate water underground by reading the fluctuations of a variety of implements, including a pendulum.
Once I use the pendulum on the map and mark out where the approximate vein is, I then go out with L rods, mark out the vein, and then I will take out my Y rods and I will walk where the vein site is to find the best spot for the well driller to drill. So with dowsing, it's just another form of listening to your instincts. And as for the term psychic, I suppose that it is a form of psychic ability. My understanding was that we have 12 sets of receptors in our body that are picking up everything around us.
While skeptics say it's virtually impossible to dig a hole in the eastern United States and not find water, there are still many who believe in the power of divining rods.
Dolores, this is feeling like the best spot for your well. So what I'm going to do is I'll mark it with a bullseye for you.
If only cows were always on target with their weather forecasts. Contrary to the myth, grazing cows prefer to face into the wind while feeding, possibly because the breeze blows the grass towards their mouth, making it easier to eat. So is the cow clairvoyant? Well, no. You could make the same predictions if you wet your finger and stuck it in the air. While the cow may lack psychic powers, there are far better forecasters coming up in the countdown. So far, there's been nothing supernatural about our first two contenders, but still to come. We'll shake your world when we reveal there's an animal that predicts earthquakes with its knees. And later, we'll meet a sleepy psychic that's scared of its own shadow. An estimated 500,000 detectable earthquakes occur in the world every year. Of those, 100,000 are felt by humans, and 100 cause damage. That's why, for centuries, people have been trying to predict when earthquakes will hit. In China, back in 132 AD, a brilliant mathematician and engineer, Cheng Hung, drew up plans for a machine that could alert the imperial court when and where an earthquake had occurred. It was a strange device covered in bronze dragons and toads. This was the world's first seismograph. Cheng Hung claimed it could detect an earthquake anywhere in the empire. The machine was elegantly simple. At the slightest tremble in the ground, an inverted pendulum would knock a ball from the mouth of a dragon into the mouth of a toad. Not only did the sound alert the court, but by examining which ball was released, it was possible to determine the direction of the waves emanating from the earthquake's epicenter. Not long after it was installed, a dragon spat out a ball, but no one in the capital felt any tremors. Skeptics declared the invention a sham, until days later, a messenger arrived with news that an earthquake had occurred 600 kilometers away in the exact direction the falling ball had indicated. Nearly 2,000 years later, Chinese engineers are still working on ways to not only detect earthquakes, but to predict when they're going to hit. They're calling on powerful computer technology and our next contender, a feathered fortune teller. Fluttering in to number 8 in our countdown of extreme psychics is the pigeon, because Chinese scientists claim it can predict earthquakes. Chinese researchers studying pigeons discovered the birds are incredibly sensitive to minute vibrations, possibly because they're attuned to the movements caused by furry four-legged predators creeping along a branch. It's thought this amazing sensitivity also helps them detect the tiny tremors that precede an earthquake, and it's all thanks to some very unusual legs. Imagine if we had legs like a pigeon. We'd have built-in vibration sensors under our knees. In the space between the two leg bones, we'd have hundreds of oval receptors connected to the body's nervous system. They're so sensitive, we'd be able to feel the tiny tremors that indicate something big is brewing. Researchers in China have long believed that monitoring the behavior of animals like pigeons helps seismologists predict the arrival of a big shake. In fact, Chinese officials already claim to have had success. Based in part on the strange antics of animals, in 1975, seismologists sent out warnings, and the city of Haicheng was evacuated. The very next day, the area was hit by a quake measuring 7.3 on the Richter scale. While 90% of Haicheng's structures were destroyed, nearly 90,000 lives were saved. Despite the life-saving prediction in Haicheng, Western seismologists are still skeptical. They discovered that a rare series of small tremors called foreshocks occurred before the large quake hit the city, thus enabling Chinese scientists to make the solid prediction. The pigeon's number 8 in the countdown because at present, we think it may be able to predict earthquakes. But one thing's for sure, it undoubtedly has the most sensitive legs in the countdown. If you thought the psychic powers of our last two contenders were a little disappointing, you'll be shocked when we meet an animal that predicts lightning strikes. And later, we'll visit a town that's crazy about its four-legged forecaster. Our countdown of the most extreme animal psychics continues in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, weather capital of the world. The town's famous for its statuesque seasonal soothsayer. On the second day of February, people come knocking on the door of our next contender. It's a gifted groundhog called Punxsutawney Phil. And he's number 7 in the countdown, because according to legend, if he sees his shadow, there'll be 6 more weeks of winter weather. So can a groundhog really predict when spring will arrive? Bill Cooper is the president of the Punxsutawney Groundhog Club Inner Circle.
Phil is known around the world. He is known as the premier weather forecaster. But he doesn't predict tomorrow's weather. He doesn't predict next week's weather. He predicts the arrival of spring. As president of the Groundhog Club, my largest single duty and chore is to speak what they call groundhogese. Well, what do you see here, big guy? It's not a spoken language like Italian or German. It's more getting the groundhog's sense. What you feel. And that's what tells me and how he communicates whether we can expect 6 more weeks of winter weather or spring is just around the corner. He has as much to gain by the arrival of spring as anybody.
That's because Punxsutawney Phil is a marmot. There are 14 different species of these big furry rodents, and these marmots live high in the mountains. Up here, you have to understand weather because the winters can be lethal. While psychic powers may be optional, it pays to be a real glutton. Every day throughout spring and summer, a marmot can munch its way through an amount of food equivalent to 1/3 of its body weight. It needs to bulk up if it's to survive the winter, because when the snows come, it won't eat again until the following spring. Marmots spend most of the winter asleep. Their heart rate can fall from 250 beats per minute to less than 10. And in deep hibernation, their brain activity may drop as much as 90%. But occasionally, one will wake up to check the temperature outside. If it's still chilly, then it's back to the burrow for more sleep. Like all marmots, a groundhog responds to the seasonal changes in light and temperature that signal the arrival of spring. So you could say that, in a way, the groundhog is a bucktooth barometer. But in Punxsutawney, they're not terribly interested in the accuracy of Phil's predictions.
There are a lot of serious and important things in life, and Groundhog Day is not one of them. It's just serious fun.
That's because this furry forecaster is a marmot, not a meteorologist. The next contender in our countdown of animal psychics is once said to have used its powers to save a man from certain death. According to legend, when a wealthy Japanese nobleman was taking shelter under a tree during a thunderstorm, he noticed a cat beckoning him into a temple. Curious, he decided to investigate. A moment later, the tree was struck by lightning. The lucky man was so grateful to the cat, he used his wealth to help the temple. And that's why the waving cat became a symbol of prosperity and good fortune. But is it true? Can these feline forecasters really predict lightning? The cat is number 6 in the countdown because according to British folklore, humans could predict the weather by observing the way a cat licked its fur. Some people even believe the cat's tail stored magic, capable of creating a storm. Strangely enough, there is some truth to the myth. Compared to other hairy mammals, cat fur loses electrons very easily, so in the cold, dry air of winter, electrostatic charges build up in a cat's fur. Feline fur has such an affinity for static electricity that cats can detect the atmospheric buildup of electrical charges that precede bad weather. That's why a gathering storm often makes cats nervous. Sometimes, to reduce the static buildup, a cat will lick its fur. Not only does the saliva make the hair more conductive, but the moisture also allows the static electricity to leak off the cat. So you could say that it's partially true. Cats can predict the arrival of an electrical storm. Could this be why the temple cat back in ancient Japan had its paw in the air? Was it actually licking its fur because there was a storm brewing? Our last 2 furry forecasters are not the only meteorologists in the countdown. Later, we'll meet an animal that can predict the arrival of hurricanes from the bottom of the sea. And later, is it possible to move objects by using the power of the mind? Our countdown of nature's most psychic creatures continues in New York City, where something's waiting for animal behavior consultant Victoria Wells.
Every day, I come home from work and my dogs are sitting at the door waiting for me. Hey kids! Where's your toy? Where's your toy? Where's your toy? You know, people ask themselves, are my dogs psychic?
Victoria's heard all the stories about pets with extrasensory perception. So is it true? Are dogs really clairvoyant?
Well, actually, they're not. They're just creatures of habit. They recognize a pattern that occurs every day. Typically, people come home at the same time and they have a ritual. Either they walk through the front door and their dogs recognize that.
There are other reasons why dogs appear to have extrasensory perception.
Which one's it under? Which one's it under? Go ahead. Go get it. Yay! Good girl. Dogs are really good at finding hidden objects, when in fact, it's really just using their senses of smell, and it's conditioning them which can sort of present itself as a psychic ability. Sometimes people mistake their dogs for seeing ghosts or seeing spirits when they stare at walls. And they're listening actually to things that are happening behind the walls, like pipes. You know, there might be a leaky pipe, and this might gross people out, but there might be roaches or mice behind the wall that they're actually hearing that we don't hear. These are great examples of how dogs are so much more sensitive to things that we cannot even see, smell, or hear.
Joanne Weber owes her life to the combination of super senses found inside her golden retriever, Willie. Joanne's one of over 2 million Americans who suffer from epileptic seizures. These episodes can last from a few seconds to a few minutes, and their unpredictability means some epileptics avoid normal activities because they fear the consequences of having seizures in public. But that's where Willie comes in. He was originally trained to remind Joanne to take her medication. But one Sunday afternoon, Willie did something extraordinary. While Joanne was out walking, Willie suddenly blocked her path. He nudged her, as he was trained to do when he heard her medicine alarm. But Joanne's alarm was at home. Willie continued to block her path and even started growling. Seconds later, Joanne had a severe epileptic seizure. Seizure alert dogs like Willie warn their owners of an oncoming attack minutes, sometimes hours, before it occurs. This allows enough time to take medication, get to a safe place, or call for assistance. Very few dogs have this amazing ability. Researchers think that dogs may be sensing subtle visual or biochemical clues that indicate an attack is imminent. And that's why dogs are number 5 in the countdown. Compared to us, their sensory superiority does give them almost supernatural powers of perception. In August 2004, residents of Florida's West Coast prepared for the worst. Alerted by the National Hurricane Center, residents and business owners secured their properties and fled from the Category 4 storm bearing down on the Gulf Coast. Hurricane Charlie ripped across Florida with winds of up to 240 kilometers per hour. But long before it arrived, our next contender had already swum to safety. Normally, the waters of Charlotte Harbor on Florida's west coast are home to several species of shark. But these seemingly psychic animals swam to the safety of deeper waters in the Gulf of Mexico hours before the hurricane crashed ashore, which is why they're number 4 in the countdown. So is it true? Can sharks really predict the arrival of hurricanes? Well, we know the sharks really did leave the bay because a scientist had been tracking their movements for over 2 years. Several species were fitted with transmitters which relayed a signal every 15 minutes. Analysis of the data revealed that every time a hurricane approached, the sharks moved to deeper, safer waters. The thought of psychic predators patrolling the seas may be a little scary, But it's not surprising since the shark has an array of senses bordering on the supernatural. A shark's eyes are 10 times more sensitive to light than ours, and it can smell blood a kilometer away. It even has sensors capable of perceiving tiny electrical charges generated by all living creatures. Some sharks are so sensitive, they may potentially detect the electricity generated by the thoughts inside our brain. However, there is another way to read someone's mind. Oscar Bermudez is not a psychic, but he knows that the truth is out there. Oscar works as a polygraph examiner with various Ventura County law enforcement agencies in California. He uses a machine that monitors physiological reactions like heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, and the sweatiness of fingertips. After wiring his subject, Oscar begins his questioning.
Between the ages of 23 and 28, do you remember lying to someone in authority?
No.
Although the questions require simple yes or no answers, the results are complicated. Even though it's commonly referred to as a lie detector, the machine can't actually detect lies. But if the readings fluctuate from normal levels, they may indicate the person is being deceptive. Most people feel threatened when asked a question they don't want to answer truthfully, thus triggering the body's fight or flight response. The result is a series of involuntary physiological changes that register on the polygraph machine. After all, nobody can consciously control their heart rate or how much their fingertips sweat.
I do not consider myself a mind reader. I read polygraph charts. And what I do is I read the polygraph charts based on your responses. I render an opinion. I do not read minds. I wish I could.
But no polygraph machine can compete with the sensory equipment inside a shark. They're far more sensitive than any human to changes in their environment. Researchers believe the specialized hair cells in the inner ear allow sharks to sense atmospheric pressure changes. An advancing hurricane creates a huge drop in atmospheric pressure. And when the barometer falls on the surface, the underwater pressure does as well, especially in the shallow seas around Florida's Gulf Coast. So while it's true sharks can predict hurricanes, it's not because they have psychic abilities. They're just using the supersensory powers that make them the most feared predator in the ocean. Perhaps it's no surprise that sensitive sharks and perceptive pooches have semi-supernatural powers. But why would anybody build a machine to harness the psychic abilities of a worm? And later, what natural disaster sent these prescient pachyderms heading for the hills? You don't have to look hard for the next contender in our countdown of extreme animal psychics. It's a bloodsucker that's an expert at hunting humans. The leech squirms into number 3 in the countdown because people once believed it had psychic powers. They knew a leech was happiest underwater, so when it crawled onto land, people knew something bad was coming. That's why, in 1851, leeches were a crucial part of Dr. George Merriweather's tempest prognosticator. This contraption could predict the arrival of storms using nothing but the psychic powers of the leech. So did the prognosticator actually work? Are leeches really slimy meteorologists? Well, Merriweather knew that leeches attempted to climb out of water before a storm. So he put 12 leeches in separate water-filled jars, each with a chain leading up to an alarm bell. In theory, when a storm approached, a leech would climb up the chain and its weight would ring the bell. The more bells that rang, the more likely a storm was coming. It sounds far-fetched, but the British insurance firm Lloyd's of London confirmed that Merriweather's tempest prognosticator actually worked. But how do leeches know in advance that a storm is coming? It's a mystery that can be answered underwater. Imagine if we were like a leech. We'd have no trouble swimming underwater, but we wouldn't be able to breathe through our mouth and nose. Instead, we'd breathe through our skin. If we were like a leech, oxygen molecules would diffuse through our skin and straight into our bloodstream. It's a great system as long as there's a high concentration of oxygen in the water. But when a storm approaches, the air pressure drops. This, in turn, reduces the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. So leeches head to the surface in search of a greater concentration of oxygen. So while there's nothing psychic about these bloodthirsty worms, it appears they really can predict the arrival of storms. This made them useful meteorologists back in the 19th century. Unfortunately, the tempest prognosticator was soon replaced by the newfangled mercury barometer. After all, would you want a dozen leeches ringing alarm bells in your house? To find the next contender, we need to travel to Thailand. It's the day after Christmas in 2004, and a group of tourists decided to go sightseeing on the back of an elephant. It may look a little wobbly, but this seat was one of the safest places in the area. The riders were having fun until something spooked the elephants. Eyewitnesses reported elephants ignoring the orders of their owners and heading inland, taking their tourists with them. A few moments later, a devastating tsunami rolled in from the sea. So did the elephants know the killer wave was coming? Can they really predict tsunamis? To find out, we need to listen to the world through the ears of an elephant. These enormous animals certainly make a lot of noise. Elephants have more than 25 different calls, blasting air out of their enormous lungs and channeling it through the trunk, a 3-meter-long resonating chamber. But these noises are easily scattered, so the sound waves only carry about 1 kilometer. That's why elephants have another way of communicating across long distances. They produce low-frequency sounds inside a cavity at the base of the tongue. We can't hear these deep rumbles unless we play them back at 10 times the normal speed. Frequencies below the audible range are referred to as infrasound. These low-frequency waves can bend around objects with very little scattering and can travel much greater distances. And elephants are not the only ones to generate infrasound. A volcano produces vast rumbles that are far too low for us to hear. In fact, anything that displaces a large amount of air and sets it in motion can create low-frequency sound waves, and that includes a tsunami. Shortly before the wall of water hit Thailand, the coast would have been bathed in infrasound. And the only ones able to hear the low-frequency rumble were the elephants. Perhaps the roar of the approaching wave was so threatening it sent them running in the opposite direction. That's why many believe it's true. An elephant can predict the arrival of a tsunami. But not even this enormous infrasound antenna can compete with the strange powers of the animal that's #1 in the countdown. We've seen the 9 contenders. They're all reputed to have amazing powers of prediction. Only one animal is a more mysterious mystic. So far in our countdown of extreme animal psychics, scientists have found an explanation for each contender's supposedly paranormal powers. That's because skeptical scientists generally don't believe in the supernatural. But the biggest unbeliever of them all was once himself a magician. James Randi is convinced that there's an explanation for all so-called psychic powers. He believes they're often caused by a magician's sleight of hand. Based in Florida, he educates the public about these so-called psychic phenomena. This man is moving the pencil simply by using the power of his mind. Or is he?
I'm going to ask Andrew to do it exactly the way he did it, with all of the gestures and such, but now it'll give it away. Watch. Rather gives it away, doesn't it?
James Randi has posted a $1 million reward to anyone who can display paranormal powers without trickery. So far, nobody's been able to claim the money. But perhaps the animal crawling in to #1 in the countdown could meet his challenge. It's the ladybug. This little insect can predict the future, not days or weeks in advance, but several months ahead, usually with 100% accuracy. It's #1 in the countdown because scientists in England have discovered a ladybug can forecast the weather 6 months in advance. And so far, nobody knows how the insect does it. There are 5,000 species of these little beetles, and the outstanding oracle of them all is the orange ladybug. In September, the beetle chooses where it's going to spend the winter, based on the unpredictable British weather. If the winter is going to be mild, it selects exposed spots, like inside a weather station. But if the months ahead are going to be harsh, it will spend the winter buried deep underground. 100 ladybugs may choose the same location. Collectively, they're gambling their lives on their ability to predict the weather. In this exposed site, they may experience an occasional freeze, but if they forecasted the weather correctly, the temperature will never fall low enough to be lethal. Would you gamble on a psychic prediction? Well, 21 Americans have 500,000 good reasons to be glad they did. Most people assume that fortune cookies originated in China, but they were actually invented in California at the beginning of the last century. And deep in the heart of San Francisco's Chinatown, the Golden Gate Fortune Cookie Factory still does things the old-fashioned way. 2 women create 20,000 handmade fortune cookies every day, and inside each are a few words of wisdom and some lucky numbers. But surely these bits of paper are just for fun. Well, officials at the U.S. Powerball lottery weren't laughing on March 30th, 2005. The game produced a record 110 second-place winners, with 21 people taking home $500,000. Initially, the officials suspected fraud, but it turned out most of the winners had received their numbers from a batch of fortune cookies. Since the chances of the combination appearing were 1 in 3 million, lottery officials are confident that it was just the way the cookie crumbled. Good fortune also shines on the orange ladybug, because when the snows melt and spring arrives, the bugs are back in business. Choosing an exposed site in winter gives them an advantage in spring. It means these psychic beetles are the first to feed on new spring growth. In a study lasting 11 years, a scientist from Cambridge University discovered the ladybug's long-range forecast never failed. But nobody knows how the beetle does it. And that's why, when it comes to psychic prediction, the ladybug really is the most extreme.